The nights in ancient Ethiopia were filled with silence. Not an empty silence, but the kind that feels watchful. The kind where the stars seem close enough to whisper. And in those highlands, history was never just about kings or battles. It was about something else, something unseen. Because according to some of Ethiopia's oldest sacred texts, the greatest danger humanity ever faced did not rise from the shadows. It came in light. That's unsettling, isn't it? We're trained to fear darkness. Monsters hide in the dark. Evil lurks in the dark. But what if deception shines? What if it dazzles? What if it looks holy? The Apostle Paul once wrote, "Even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light." That's 2 Corinthians 11:14. Most of us read that as metaphor, a poetic warning. But what if Paul wasn't being poetic at all? What if he was echoing a much older tradition? One preserved not in Rome, not in Constantinople, but in Ethiopia. Because while much of the Western world streamlined its biblical canon, Ethiopia kept texts that others left behind. The Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, writings that describe radiant beings who are almost indistinguishable from angels except for one detail: their intention. And here's the part that makes this impossible to ignore. In Ethiopian tradition, the demon of light was never just symbolism. It was recorded, named, remembered, not as a horned creature in the dark, but as brilliance that misleads. So stay with me, because by the end of this journey, the real question won't be whether such a being existed. It will be this: how would you recognize false light if it stood right in front of you? If you value deep dives into the parts of history most people never hear about, consider subscribing, like this video, so others can find it too. Now let's step into the highlands and into a story that refuses to fade. What if one of the oldest Christian civilizations on Earth quietly kept books the rest of the world decided to set aside? Not as curiosities, not as hidden relics, but as scripture. High in the Ethiopian highlands, long before modern borders, long before printing presses, monks sat in stone-hewn monasteries copying texts by hand. Ink made from soot and honey, parchment stretched from animal skin, candlelight flickering against carved rock walls, and among the texts they preserved were writings most Western Christians would never read inside a Bible. The Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees. For many in the West, those names sound apocryphal, peripheral, extra-biblical, but in Ethiopia, they were never extra. They were part of a living canon, woven into liturgy, memory, and theology. They were read aloud, studied, revered. And that difference matters, because when much of Europe moved toward a standardized biblical canon in the 4th century through regional councils like Carthage in 3097 AD, the boundaries of Scripture narrowed in the Latin West. This wasn't a dramatic conspiracy, it was a gradual process of discernment and consensus. Texts were weighed, some were affirmed, others were left outside the emerging framework. But Ethiopia was not simply an extension of Rome. Christianity reached the kingdom of Aksum early traditionally in the 4th century through Frumentius. And from there, the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church developed along its own path. Connected to broader Christian currents, yes, but not governed by Western decisions, not shaped by later European theological debates in quite the same way. So while Enoch faded from most Western Bibles, it remained alive in Ge'ez manuscripts. That's where things become historically fascinating. In 1947, when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in Qumran, fragments of one Enoch were found among them. Suddenly, a text long considered fringe in the West was shown to have been widely read in Second Temple Judaism. It wasn't a medieval invention. It was ancient, deeply embedded in the world that shaped early Christianity. And Ethiopia had preserved it all along. Think about that for a moment. While empires rose and fell, while libraries burned, while theological debates reshaped Europe, in the highlands of East Africa, scribes continued copying Enoch as sacred history. That preservation creates a different theological atmosphere, because Enoch is not a quiet book. It speaks of watchers fallen angels who descended, taught forbidden knowledge, and altered the moral fabric of humanity. Jubilees expands on these traditions, introducing figures like Mastema. These are not abstract metaphors. They belong to a worldview where the spiritual realm is structured, active, and intertwined with human history. In much of Western Christianity, the figure of Satan gradually consolidated into a more simplified image tempter, an adversary, sometimes rendered visually with horns and shadow. The complexity of Second Temple angelology faded into the background, but in Ethiopia, the older layers remained closer to the surface. That doesn't mean Ethiopian tradition rejected later Christian theology. It means it retained an earlier stratum alongside it, a continuity that feels almost archaeological, like uncovering sediment layers of belief that were never fully eroded. And here's where the tension builds, because if you preserve Enoch and Jubilees as living scripture, you also preserve their cosmology. Their language about radiant beings, about deception, not as grotesque darkness, but as misdirected brilliance. The idea that fallen entities could appear luminous, that falsehood could resemble holiness. This isn't speculative invention. It flows directly from the preserved texts and their interpretive traditions. And when the Apostle Paul writes, "Even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light," Ethiopian readers encounter that line differently. For them, it resonates with books already in their canon. It echoes a worldview they never lost. That continuity is extraordinary. Ethiopia became, in a sense, a guardian of theological memory, not isolated but distinct, not frozen in time but carrying forward strands that elsewhere thinned. And it wasn't just texts, it was identity. Ethiopia saw itself as a land of covenantal continuity. Traditions surrounding the Ark of the Covenant in Aksum reinforced that self-understanding. Whether one views those claims historically or symbolically, they reflect a deeper conviction that divine presence and sacred responsibility endured in that land. Where divine glory resides, vigilance follows. So the preservation of Enoch and Jubilees wasn't accidental. It aligned with a broader worldview, one that treated spiritual history as ongoing, layered, and serious. No spectacle, no theatrical mythology, just a quiet, persistent memory that the unseen realm mattered. And this is where the emotional weight settles in, because if Ethiopia preserved what others set aside, then it also preserved a warning the West gradually softened. A warning that deception may not confront you in obvious rebellion. It may speak your language, use your symbols, shine with your light. That theological thread runs like gold through Ethiopian manuscripts. True light, false light, discernment between them. So the question becomes unavoidable. If a civilization can preserve texts for over 1,000 years, through invasion, isolation, and change, what exactly were they so determined not to forget? And what did those texts say about the being who could wear the appearance of heaven itself? To answer that, we have to look closer at one name preserved in Jubilees, Mastema. What if evil did not rebel against heaven, but asked permission to stay? That question sits quietly inside the book of Jubilees, and it changes the emotional temperature of the story. When we first hear the word demon, we imagine defiance, open war, a force in opposition to God's authority. But Mastema does not enter the narrative that way. He appears in a much more unsettling posture. He petitions. In Jubilees, after the destruction that followed the rebellion of the Watchers, the spirits of the giant's offspring of that rebellion are described as afflicting humanity. The text presents a crisis. Humanity is being led astray again, and in response, a judgment comes. The corrupting spirits are to be bound, but then Mastema speaks. He asks that a portion of those spirits remain, not all, just some, so that he might exercise authority over them, so that humanity might still be tested. That detail is easy to overlook, but pause for a moment. This is not chaos running loose. This is a structured request inside a divine framework. Mastema is not portrayed as an independent god of darkness. He is not sovereign. He operates within boundaries. The text suggests divine permission. That theological nuance matters. If this sounds familiar, it should. In the book of Job, the adversary Hassan appears among the sons of God. He questions Job's righteousness, but he cannot act without God's consent. He receives limits, boundaries. You may go this far, but no further. So Mastema belongs to that older layer of Jewish thought. A prosecuting figure, an accuser, a tester. But here's where the tension builds. Ethiopian tradition, preserving Jubilees and Enoch together, does not leave Mastema as a distant courtroom figure. The interpretive tradition surrounding these texts emphasizes his role not merely as tester but as deceiver, not brute force, influence. And if we bring back what we've already seen in Enoch, the description of luminous beings, radiant watchers descending with knowledge, then the emotional picture shifts. The danger is no longer grotesque rebellion. It is proximity to holiness, nearness to the divine structure. Mastema does not need horns. He needs credibility. And that is where the phrase radiant adversary becomes so powerful. The text itself does not linger on physical descriptions in the way later medieval imagination would. It doesn't dramatize grotesque imagery. Instead, it situates Mastema within a world where heavenly beings are luminous by nature. Radiance is normal in the divine court. So if a being operates within that sphere, what would deception look like? Not darkness, misused light. That is the theological shift Ethiopia preserves. Evil is not always the opposite of divine order. Sometimes it is the distortion of it. A bending of justice into accusation, a twisting of testing into manipulation. And we must be careful here. The text does not claim Mastema overthrows heaven. It does not elevate him to equal status with God. That would go beyond the data. Jubilees keeps him under divine authority, but the narrative allows space for something subtler. Permission does not eliminate danger. Testing does not eliminate deception. And here we reach a quiet crescendo. If Mastema is allowed to remain in order to test humanity, then discernment becomes central to human responsibility. The threat is not annihilation. It is misdirection. Humanity is not crushed by force. It is drawn off course. That feels different, doesn't it? It reframes the spiritual struggle. The battleground is not primarily physical. It is moral, cognitive, relational, and when later Christian readers encounter Paul's words, even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light, Ethiopian tradition hears resonance, not metaphor alone. Because in their preserved texts, heavenly beings are already luminous. Radiance does not guarantee righteousness. That's the crescendo of this section. The adversary is radiant, not because evil creates light, but because it can inhabit the appearance of it. Now, before we move too quickly into symbolism, we need to stay grounded. Jubilees does not provide elaborate narrative scenes of Mastema glowing before humans. It outlines roles, permissions, authority structures. The radiance language grows more from the broader Enochic cosmology and its description of angelic beings. Ethiopian tradition, reading these texts together, draws theological coherence from them, and that coherence produces a sobering conclusion. Holiness can be mimicked, authority can be simulated, and testing can become entanglement if wisdom fails. Which brings us to the emotional edge of this tradition. If a being operates within divine permission, if he can function near the structure of heaven, if light itself is not a reliable indicator of truth, then how exactly were believers expected to tell the difference? How did Ethiopian monks, preserving these texts for centuries, imagine protecting themselves from something that did not look like an enemy at all? That question takes us deeper, not into more names, but into theology itself. Because to understand the radiant adversary, we have to understand the meaning of light. If light is the symbol of God, what happens when light itself becomes suspect? That's not a small question. It reaches into the very center of biblical language. From the opening lines of Genesis, "Let there be light," to the Gospel of John declaring, "The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it." Light is not just imagery. It is revelation, presence, truth, life. In the ancient world, and especially within the Ethiopian Christian imagination, light was never decorative. It was theological. So when we speak of a false light, we are not talking about a simple disguise. We are talking about a distortion of one of the most sacred symbols in Scripture. That's why this idea is so unsettling. In Western Christianity, evil often becomes visually associated with shadow, Darkness equals danger. Light equals safety. It's intuitive, almost comforting in its simplicity, but the older Jewish and Enochic traditions preserved in Ethiopia complicate that instinct. Because angelic beings are described as radiant by nature, the heavenly court is luminous, glory shines. Radiance in itself proves nothing, and that's where the theology deepens. Augustine once wrote that evil is not a substance of its own, but a privation of good, a distortion, a lack, a bending of something originally ordered. C.S. Lewis echoed this centuries later, describing evil as a parasite. It does not create, it corrupts. If that framework holds, then false light would not be an independent source of illumination. It would be borrowed brilliance, misapplied glory, a reflection detached from its rightful center. That's subtle, and it matters. Because in that understanding, evil does not invent holiness. It imitates it. Now consider the line from Isaiah 14, often associated in Christian tradition with Lucifer. How you have fallen from heaven, O morning star, son of the dawn. The Hebrew phrase Hillel ben Shaka carries imagery of brightness, of dawn light. Whether that passage originally referred to a historical king or later became linked to satanic imagery, the association between downfall and brightness entered Christian imagination early. Light, fall, distortion. So when Paul writes, even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light, he is not inventing a metaphor from thin air. He is drawing from a symbolic world already thick with tension. And Ethiopia, by preserving Enoch and Jubilees, never lost that tension. In that theological environment, light is sacred, but not automatically trustworthy. What matters is alignment, orientation, source. And this brings us to a quiet crescendo. If evil is a distortion of good, then it will always appear close to good. Close enough to confuse, close enough to persuade. It will use the same vocabulary, the same rituals, the same promises. That's the emotional edge of the theology of false light. It does not challenge you with obvious rebellion. It stands beside truth. It speaks with confidence. It feels familiar. But here we must stay grounded. The preserved Ethiopian texts do not present an elaborate philosophical treatise on light metaphysics. They narrate cosmology. They describe beings. They outline authority structures. The theological synthesis grows from how these texts are read together over centuries within liturgical life, and within that life, discernment becomes central. Light in Scripture is consistently tied to moral character. God is light. In Him, there is no darkness at all. That's from John 1:5. Notice what the verse does. It does not define light as brightness. It defines it as purity, faithfulness, truthfulness. So the question shifts. Not, does it shine, but does it reflect God's character? That's the turning point. False light may dazzle. True light transforms. False light may promise elevation. True light calls for humility. And this distinction is not abstract. It becomes deeply practical in monastic theology. Ethiopian monks did not sit in caves debating symbolic theory for its own sake. They lived with the assumption that spiritual experiences could be misleading, that visions could deceive, that pride could masquerade as revelation. In that context, brilliance alone is not evidence. Obedience matters. Fruit matters. Alignment with Christ's self-giving pattern matters. And now the theology reaches its crest. If the most sacred symbol, light, can be imitated, then the human heart cannot rely on instinct alone. Awe is not proof. Emotional intensity is not proof. Emotional intensity is not proof. Even spiritual experience is not proof. Only coherence with the character of God. That realization reframes the entire narrative of Mastema and the radiant adversary. The danger is not physical destruction. It is theological confusion, a misidentification of glory. And here, very carefully, we can acknowledge something timeless without drifting from the historical focus. This theology was never meant to produce paranoia. It was meant to produce humility, vigilance, self-examination, not fear of light, but careful attention to its source. So the theology of false light leaves us with a pressing question. If brilliance can be borrowed, if radiance can be imitated, if even heavenly language can be twisted, how did Ethiopian spiritual communities train themselves to test what appeared holy? How did they cultivate discernment strong enough to resist a light that felt real? To answer that, we have to step inside the monasteries themselves. What if the greatest spiritual discipline was not seeing visions, but questioning them? Imagine a monk alone in the Ethiopian highlands. Stone walls carved into the side of a mountain, wind moving through narrow openings, candlelight trembling against ancient manuscripts. He has fasted, he has prayed, he has recited scripture by memory. And then something appears. Not darkness, not terror, but brilliance. In many spiritual traditions, that would be the moment of triumph, a sign of divine favor. But in Ethiopian monastic thought, that moment was not celebration, it was testing. Because alongside the preservation of Enoch and Jubilees grew something just as important, a culture of discernment. The Apostle John wrote, "Beloved, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they are from God." That's John 4:1. In Ethiopia, that instruction was not abstract theology. It was practical survival. If false light was possible, if radiant deception could exist, then spiritual life required caution. Not cynicism, not fear, but careful evaluation. And here's where the story becomes deeply human. Ethiopian monks did not assume that intensity equaled authenticity. They did not assume that beauty guaranteed truth. Instead, they developed criteria, questions, patterns. What does the message produce? Does it lead to humility? Does it align with the character of Christ? Does it call for self-sacrifice or self-exaltation? Those questions mattered more than spectacle. The tradition does not describe dramatic exorcisms of glowing figures on every hillside. It describes something quieter, a discipline of interior clarity, a suspicion of pride, a recognition that arrogance often hides behind spiritual language. And this is where the tension rises. Because pride rarely announces itself as pride. It arrives as insight, as special knowledge, as elevation above others. In Enochic literature, the Watchers taught forbidden knowledge skills and secrets that dazzled humanity. Knowledge itself was not evil, but the motive and the distortion were. So Ethiopian monastic theology absorbed a sobering lesson. Brilliance without obedience is dangerous. That's the crescendo of this section. Discernment became the defense system of the soul. Not intellectual skepticism alone, not blind trust, but alignment. The monks were trained to measure every experience against the pattern of Christ's humility, service, endurance, self-giving love. If a vision encouraged domination, it was rejected. If a message fostered arrogance, it was suspect. If an encounter separated a monk from communal wisdom, it was questioned. Notice how grounded that is. The emphasis is not on hunting demons, it is on cultivating character. The theology of false light does not produce obsession with deception. It produces seriousness about virtue, and here we must avoid exaggeration. Ethiopian monastic literature does not claim that every bright experience is demonic. It does not reduce spiritual life to suspicion. It assumes God truly reveals himself. Light is still sacred, grace is still real, but the existence of Mastema and Jubilees, the memory of radiant watchers in Enoch, and Paul's warning about an angel of light create a sober backdrop. Radiance alone is not proof. That understanding shaped practices. Fasting disciplined desire, prayer clarified intention. Community provided accountability. A monk did not interpret his own experience in isolation. Elders listened. Wisdom accumulated over generations weighed in. The community acted as a safeguard against self-deception, and that communal aspect is crucial. False light thrives in isolation. True light withstands examination. That may be one of the most enduring theological contributions of this tradition. Not a dramatic mythology, but a structured approach to spiritual evaluation. And here, very carefully, we can see why this mattered historically. Ethiopia preserved texts describing radiant deception, It also preserved the tools to respond to it. The warning and the remedy developed side by side, not paranoia, preparation. So imagine again that monk in the highlands. The candle flickers. A presence feels near. Instead of surrendering to awe, he pauses. He tests. He measures the message against humility. That pause, that moment of restraint, may have been the most powerful spiritual act of all. And now, the narrative tightens. If discernment was so central, if communities built entire spiritual systems around distinguishing true light from false, what does that say about how seriously they took the threat? Why would a civilization invest centuries in guarding against brilliance unless they believed the danger was real, recurring, and subtle? To understand that urgency, we have to step back out of the monastery walls and look at how this warning shaped Ethiopia's identity itself. What if the most dangerous lie in history never looked like a lie at all? Not ancient, not medieval, but recurring. When Ethiopian monks copied Enoch and Jubilees, when they preserved the memory of Mastema, when they repeated Paul's warning that even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light, they were not archiving mythology for curiosity's sake. They were preserving a principle, and that principle was not tied to one century. It was timeless. Because at the heart of this entire tradition lies a simple but unsettling claim. Deception does not always oppose truth openly. Sometimes it stands beside it. Sometimes it echoes it. Sometimes it borrows its language. And that idea travels well across centuries. Now, we need to be careful here. The Ethiopian texts do not offer detailed predictions about modern institutions or future political systems. They do not name contemporary movements. They do not map directly onto present-day structures. But they do preserve a theological pattern. Light can be imitated. Authority can be simulated. Righteousness can be performed. And that pattern remains intelligible today. Not because history repeats itself mechanically, but because human nature does. The crescendo of the story is not about a glowing figure in the sky. It's about discernment in ordinary life. The monks were not preparing for dramatic apocalyptic encounters every day. They were training their hearts to recognize subtle distortion. And subtle distortion is not bound to the ancient world. Consider how often moral language is used to justify questionable action. How easily power can wrap itself in the vocabulary of service. How quickly charisma can be mistaken for character. That observation does not require conspiracy thinking. It requires realism about the human condition. The theology of false light reminds us that sincerity is not the same as truth. Brilliance is not the same as goodness. Confidence is not the same as integrity. And here, the emotional weight settles in. If deception comes cloaked in chaos, it is easier to resist. If it comes cloaked in beauty, it requires maturity. That was the warning Ethiopia preserved, and perhaps that is why the theme feels so enduring. It does not produce paranoia, it produces humility. It calls for examination, not of others, first, but of ourselves. Because if light can be imitated externally, pride can also imitate righteousness internally. That may be the deepest layer of this ancient warning. The adversary described in Jubilees operates within permission. The watchers in Enoch descend with knowledge that appears beneficial. Paul's angel of light does not arrive announcing destruction. He arrives persuasive. So the question shifts again from historical curiosity to personal awareness. What do we trust too quickly? What do we accept because it shines? The Ethiopian tradition would not answer that question with suspicion of everything bright. It would answer with alignment to character, with coherence between message and humility, with patience before proclamation. And now we reach the final crest. History is not only about kings and battles, it is about ideas that shape civilizations. And one of the most powerful ideas Ethiopia guarded was this: the struggle between true light and false light is ongoing, not in spectacle, but in discernment. That is why the story still matters, not because we can prove every detail as empirical event, not because we can trace every spirit through documented history, but because the pattern rings true across time. Evil rarely advertises itself as evil. It persuades, it reframes, it dazzles. And so the ancient highlands whisper a quiet caution. Test the spirit. Examine the fruit. Do not confuse radiance with righteousness. If a civilization could preserve that warning for over 1,000 years, through invasion, isolation, and change, perhaps it believed something essential was at stake. And maybe the final question is not whether Mastema once walked the edges of sacred history. Maybe the final question is this: if false light stood beside you, calm, articulate, convincing, would you recognize it, or would it look too much like the real thing?